Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the FIDE World Rapid and Blitz Team Championships 2024. Now, this event is being held in Astana, Kazakhstan, and there are many strong players playing, including the 5-time world champion Magnus Carlsen. Now, you guys are in for a treat because the first game we're going to be starting off with was played in round number 8 yesterday. I did my recap a little bit early, so I was unable to cover this game, but it was played between Magnus Carlsen and his successor, the current world chess champion Ding Liren. Now, Ding has been missing in action recently. He's only played a handful of tournaments. He has not performed well, generally speaking, but it does seem like he's trying to right the ship before his world championship match in November with none other than Gukesh from India. So let's jump right into the action. So game number 8, Magnus with a white piece against Ding, and let's get to it. So the game starts with a move e4. Ding goes to e5. We get knight to f3, knight c6, and now we have bishop b5. Ding plays a6. We get bishop to a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, and now we have the move d3. Now, I went through those moves a little bit quickly, but thus far this is very standard. Both players have had this position many different times. All right, so here Ding plays the move b5. We get the move bishop to b3. We get d6 being played, and now Magnus goes a4. Now, those of you guys who are very big chess aficionados, you probably will recall that this was played a lot in the World Chess Championship match between Ian Nepomniachtchi and Ding Liren. In fact, the final game of the match, which Ian would lose with the white piece in the rapid tiebreaker, was in this closed Spanish. So we get a4, bishop d7 is played here by black. Now if white trades the pawns on b5, black can simply recapture the rook on a8. So we get the move knight to c3. Ding plays knight a5, bishop to a2. Of course, Magnus wants to keep the bishop alive on the long diagonal. Ding goes b4. We get knight to e2. We have the move c5 here being played. Black simply wants to try and grip the center here, stop white from playing d4, but also expanding on the queen side, maybe playing for c4, b3 down the road in addition to covering the square. We get the move knight d2 from Magnus, and this is a move that actually to me was something fairly new. I had not seen this idea before the game was played, but it's actually very logical, and it shows one very important point, which is that Magnus Carlsen is still studying chess very actively, and he is looking for new ideas. Now, the reason I really like this move is twofold. First of all, in this position, if white plays a move like, let's say, knight g3, at some point black has the potential here to play b3, temporarily sacrificing a pawn, because now white has this very ugly bishop that's walled in by the pawn, and both these pawns on a4 and b3 are super weak here, and black should be fine. So that's one idea. The second idea is down the road, maybe black can go rook c8 and c4 again to play for b3 potentially, and opening up the queen side. So when Magnus here plays move knight d2, it stops both of these ideas. If black goes b3, white simply takes with the horse, and after takes, the bishop is alive on the diagonal, and also your pawn structure is intact in this position. Additionally, if black were to play the move bishop takes a4, which I didn't point out on the previous move, white will sack the bishop on f7 temporarily, and after rook takes a4, knight c6, and a move like f4, white is doing very well here. Black is unable to castle the king here, and white has a big advantage. So Ding decides to castle, and now Magnus plays the move f4, and this is a great approach here because what Magnus is doing is he's trying to open up the f file. When you combine that with the long diagonal and then also the knight covering these two squares, black is already in quite a bit of trouble. Now the computer will laugh and say black is equal, but I think from a human perspective, and especially in a rapid or a blitz game, white already has a big advantage and it's very hard to play. So Ding goes rook to b8. We get the move knight to c4 here from Magnus. Knights come off the board. If black does not trade the knights, probably you can go knight c6 here, but now after like h3 and knight g3, long term white is doing very, very well. A lot of pressure on the center of the board, and it's simply very difficult to deal with. So Ding decides to trade the knights, and he goes a5 here, but there is a big issue. When you look at this black pawns here, you'll notice they're all on dark squares here, but you can't really open up any files. If you ever play, I'm just going to play a random move like h3. If you play d5, white simply takes. So you have no way to really open up any of these files easily, and if you ever take on f4 after knight takes f4, white has the only open file here, the f file for the rook. White also controls the central square on d5, and it's just very, very hard for black to play. So after a5, Magnus trades on e5. We have to move knight g3, and already here we've reached a very, very stable pawn structure. Neither side can really do a whole lot on the queen side per se. Black's pawns on a5 and c5 are blockaded. They can't move forward. Additionally, if you ever go b3, white will simply capture. So white is clearly better here. Nice diagonal for the bishop, knight jumping to f5, open f file for the rook, and Magnus has achieved a dream position. So Ding goes knight to e8. Now we get to move queen to h5. Knight d6 is played here. A very nice maneuver here from Ding, I have to admit. Based on his recent play in tournaments, you do feel like this is a position where he could easily collapse, but he is finding some really nice ideas. Because after queen h5 and knight d6 was played, if Magnus were to take this pawn on e5 here, for example, after takes, and bishop e6, you can't really go b3 here because of bishop f6 attacking on this diagonal. There's also something better, which I think is bishop d6 as well. But regardless, the two b's will play in this position. So Magnus goes bishop d5, basically keeping the wooden shield alive on all the diagonals here. Ding goes bishop to f6, guarding the pawn on e5 from being captured. And now Magnus plays the move b3. Now at this point, we've reached a position where the pawns are completely fixed. White has the only pawn break here with pawn to c3. Black can never push the pawn to c4. So with this closed structure, all of the play here is going to revolve around the king side. So we get the move g6 here from Ding. Queen f3, bishop g7. Magnus goes bishop e3. We get rook c8, guarding the pawn on c5. Queen f2, queen c7, and now we have the move bishop g5 being played. Now when we take stock of the position, Magnus has a big advantage here because black has this weak pawn on c5, weak pawn on f7, and white has basically no weaknesses at all in the position. So we get bishop e6, bishop takes bishop, pawn takes, and now Magnus goes queen d2. Now you're probably looking at the eval bar thinking, wait, why does white have such a big advantage according to the computer? And the reason white has such a big advantage here is that in the long run, black has these stacked pawns on e5 and e6, which are both potential weaknesses. Black can never go c4 here. For example, black could trade pawns on d3 and play on the open c file here. Black would be doing very well. But if you ever go c4 here, not rook f1, sorry, which is in the game. If you ever go c4, white can simply take the pawn on c4, and white is up a pawn in the position. So if you don't have this break to open up the c file, then all these pawns, all 5 of these pawns potentially, can become serious weaknesses. And additionally, in the long run, there's one other very important factor to keep in mind, which is that when you look at the b's here, and this is very advanced because at a lower level nobody should be thinking about this, but you'll notice that black's pawns here, these pawns specifically on the queen side, are all the same color as the bishop, whereas the dark square b here for Ding cannot touch anything. All of white's pawns are on the opposite color of the bishop, and so structurally speaking, if this gets to say a bishop endgame, black will be losing. So we get the move rook takes rook, rook takes rook, rook f8, rooks come off, bishop e3. We get knight to f7 from Ding, queen f2, knight d8, knight f1, and now Ding goes queen e7, knight d2, knight c6, and knight c4. You're probably wondering why I went through this move so quickly. Is because the players are just aiming for the optimal setup of the pieces, where Magnus has this bastion on c4, the knight hits both pawns, the knight on c6 guards both pawns, and additionally the queen and the bishop are both guarding this pawn on c5. So it really hinges upon these 3 pawns and whether black can defend all of them. Now the one good thing for Ding here is that he has reached a setup where he can't do anything. He can never move this knight away. Let's just say he goes knight d4 here because white can take either the a5 pawn or the e5 pawn and win the game. So you can't move the knight. It's stuck guarding both the pawns. So this knight is glued. You can't move the queen. If you go queen b7, then you lose the pawn on c5. And same thing if you move the bishop, you'll lose this pawn here on c5 as well. So you can't move the knight, the queen, or the bishop. And in a rapid game where you're down a lot of time like Ding is here, that is a good thing because now Ding can start doing the classic strategy that we call Ding chilling, which is Ding will leave all of his pieces on these squares and not move any of them. And it's on Magnus to find a conclusive way to win the game. So Magnus, we get h5, Magnus plays h4, king g7, g3, king g8, king g2, king g7. Ding is chilling. And here we get the move g4. Now, one of the maxims in chess that we talk about a lot is that you need to create many weaknesses. The general theory goes that if your opponent has one weakness in a game of chess, they should be able to defend that one weakness, that one weak point, and not lose the game. But if you can create more and more weaknesses, there are potential chances to where you can win the game because you can play on both sides, and it's very hard to defend multiple points of weakness. Honestly, if you look at war strategy, it's the same thing. It's very hard to defend in multiple places at the same time. So after king to g7, we got this move g4. I could have made a little bit of a World War II joke and Germany and getting pushed on all sides, but I will refrain from that at the moment. So we get the move g4 from Magnus. We get pawn takes pawn. Now we have queen g3, queen f6, and the move bishop g5 is played here by Magnus. Now queen g3 is a very nice touch from Magnus because he is pressuring both the pawns on e5 and g4 here. And so after queen f6 and bishop g5 is played, Ding has a very tough decision. Does he go queen f3 here into this very unpleasant endgame where he has all these weak pawns? Let's say black plays knight d4 just to illustrate something. After king g2, you cannot take this pawn because after knight a5, let's say bishop d6, knight c4, bishop c7, and a5, a6, this a pawn is rolling up the board and white will win. Now, the reason the computer does not say this is just lost on the spot is that apparently black can keep waiting here, just sitting and waiting, and it's not saying it's lost here, oddly enough, because this knight is very critical. It guards both the pawns, but there's a third point which is very important as well, which is that it stops this bishop from coming in from behind and infiltrating via the d8 square. If white could get this bishop, just to illustrate the point, if white could get the bishop here and black, let's just say black couldn't take, after bishop takes a5 or even bishop c7 here, suddenly the bishop is hitting all the pawns and white will win the game in short order. So very tough decision for Ding. Ding ultimately plays move queen f7. Now Magnus trades the knights on e5 and we're in an endgame. Now the big thing here about this endgame and why Magnus should be winning is because if we look at the bishops, notice these pawns, they are all on the same colors as B. If the B can get behind and eat all the pawns, white will win the game. Additionally, when let's just say trades happens, all of white's pawns here are on the opposite colors. So because of the pawn structure and this bishop being able to target all the black pawns, structurally it is completely lost. So Ding goes queen to e8, we get king g3, bishop g7, queen e7, queen b8, bishop f4 is played. Not king takes pawn, by the way, because after queen to h2, suddenly the black queen gets in, and now black should be able to save the game. So you get bishop f4, e5, bishop g5, queen b6 is played here to stop white from going bishop to f6, winning the game. Magnus plays bishop e3, another important move, because if you were to take the pawn, there's c4 here, and suddenly the queen is going to g1, and the white king becomes very vulnerable. So we get bishop e3. Ding plays queen c6, we get queen takes c5. Now this is a big mistake from Magnus here. He should have taken with the bishop here, and the reason is the queen still has no way to enter, but the queen on c6 that is, but the queen on e7 stops black from going to the open f file with the queen, because after queen c5 and queen f6 is played, king takes g4 and queen to f1, the queen has gotten in. Now mind you, it's not so simple to show why this is still okay for black, because you're not able to easily attack the king, but the computer here, because of how strong they are, already says that after queen to e1, bishop f2, and queen d2, black is drawing the game, because a pawn on c2, which is the base of the chain, is very weak, and your king is also very weak as well. So if you ever take the pawn on a5, I think black's supposed to check. He could maybe take this one, although I think after queen d5 the queen holds the juicers with the right triangle and white's probably winning, but there is queen to f4, suddenly there's a check, and if you go back and you go here, you still can't dodge all the checks. Eventually the game will end in a draw. Now Ding is very low on time, hard to be critical. He goes for this move bishop f6 instead, trying to target the pawn on h4. Magnus goes bishop f2, get this move queen h1. Again, these moves are not going to be perfect because both players are getting low on time, but apparently after queen c7 check and then queen g4 here, you're targeting the pawn and you guard the pawn on h4 at the same time. Or actually no, I think you're supposed to flick the check first. You're supposed to flick the check and then queen g4 to target the pawn, guard the pawn on h4, and after say king to h7, white can go h5 here, and after queen e1, bishop f2, there are simply no checks in the position. Instead, Magnus goes bishop f2, we get queen to h1, queen c7, king g8, check, king g7, queen d7, king g8, and now Magnus plays the move queen h3, stopping the threats towards this pawn on h4. Here we get the move queen to c1 from Ding. Magnus goes queen g4, we get queen takes c2, takes bishop g7, and here Magnus spends nearly 1 minute before playing the critical move which wins the game. Now this is a skill that you cannot teach, but it's one of those innate abilities that really strong players have, where they can sort of sense what's going on in the position. Now it'd be very easy here to panic because black is targeting both the pawns on b3 and d3, so you might want to be thinking, well, maybe I check and go queen d5 to guard the pawns, but after queen d5, queen d2, we're in a very similar situation where black is trying to check with the queen, and Magnus, after using up nearly all his time, finds this very critical move h5, which wins the game here. Now the reason this is winning here is that this threat of h6 is mostly unstoppable without trading off some material. So Ding plays queen takes pawn. If you were to take this pawn after h6, queen f7 here, for example, just to illustrate why, white can go h7 check. If you go here, you lose the queen. And after king f8, there's bishop c5, checking the king e8, queen c6, queen d7. And now I think you go check and probably you trade. And I think you just bring the king over. But you can bring the king over. You can also probably check here and win this way as well to stop the pawn. But even going Even going king here, b3, bishop a3 is good enough because the king gets over to eat the pawn, and black will be distracted by this pawn on h7, which is trying to queen on h8. So after h5, we get takes, king g2, ding plays queen d2, trying to stop h6. This does lose, but there isn't really much black can do. If you go king h8 here, after h6, bishop f8, check, king g8, white can simply go check, king h7, check, and after king g8, h7, king g7, queen takes, white has an extra bishop on f2 and will win the game. So ding goes queen d2, but now Magnus plays h6. Ding has to trade the queens, and after bishop to b6, the dust is settled, and Magnus Carlsen is winning, as he is going to be able to capture the queenside pawns. And also, just as a nice note, all the white pawns opposite color of this bishop, black's pawns all in the same color as this bishop. So the opposite color of the pawns here, and the fact that Magnus can attack Ding's pawns, means that he will win the game. So the game concludes very shortly after king f7, king f3, king e6 takes, and here Ding resigns in view of bishop f8, king e3, and here black cannot go king d6 because you would lose the pawn. Let's just say king d7, king d3, king c6, king c4. Magnus will mop up a second pawn here, and then he just starts pushing the p. Pawn on e5 is weak, and it's all but hopeless. So a very, very nice win for Magnus Carlsen in this game against Ding. Really a positional masterpiece in my opinion. There are obviously some mistakes when the players have little time, but Magnus just shows his great understanding. Really, this game came down to the pawn structure on the queen side and Magnus understanding how to attack the pawns, and it's just a masterclass in precision. All right, so that's the first game we want to look at. Now, the second game that we're going to be taking a look at is a very critical last round game. Now, going into round number 12, Magnus's team is about 1 point out of the lead, but they're paired against a team which is GMHans.com. Now, as you'll notice from the players' names, this is a game between Hans Niemann and Ian Nepomniachtchi because Magnus Carlsen chose to sit out in the final round and not play. Now, before we get into the game, I'll just make two statements. The first thing is there was a tweet from Hans before the game, which should be the thumbnail to this video, which says, if you aren't willing to handle things on the chessboard, don't even bother playing. Chess is the greatest combination of art, and war cowardice leads to inevitable defeat. So Hans, with his usual bluster, we don't actually know the reason Magnus didn't play, but my one other point that I'm going to make, and I think people really should keep this in mind, is that it is ironic to see Hans talking about settling things over the chessboard when in reality Hans is the one who did file a $100 million lawsuit and try to settle things away from the board. So that's the only comment I'm going to make about it specifically, but nonetheless, the game being played is between Hans and Ian Nepomniachtchi. So Hans with the white pieces, the game starts out with e4, we get e5, knight f3, Ian playing the classic Petrov defense, we get knight e5, d6, knight d3, takes, queen e2, queen e7, and now we have the move knight f4. After knight f6, we get the move d4, and already the queens are coming off the board very early, and the game is trending in a direction towards a draw. So Ian goes knight c6, Hans plays c3, we get d5, f3 is played here, knight to d8 from Ian, intending to go c6 to protect the pawn on d5, and additionally black would love to get something like c6 followed by bishop to d6. You have a nice chain of 3, and you get a bishop to the center of the board. So we get bishop to d3. Bishop to d6 is played by Ian. We have the move king to f2, and now we have the move knight e6 being played. Here Hans plays knight e2, we get h5, h4, and now the move a5, a4, and we get c6. Now the position is very close to a mirror with the exception of the knight on f6 and the knight on b1. Pawn on f3, very nicely placed pawn as it stops knight e4 and knight g4, but in general with the symmetry of the pawns and the piece placement, the game, it does not have a lot of meat to it. So we get b3, b6, bishop a3, king d7, takes, knight d2, and now we get the move bishop a6. We get the swap, knight to f1, g6, knight e3, and now we have rook a7. Ian's idea here is to stack the two rooks in the center of the board on the e file. The pawn on g6 also stops knight to f5 for white. So unless one of the sides can explode the center with c4 or c5, the game should peter out. Get rook d1, rook e8, rook d2, rook e7, knight c2, and now we get the move knight g8 from Ian, trying to put the knight on h6 and go to f5 to hit the pawn on h4. We get the move rook e1, knight g7 being played, opening up the e file for the rooks and potentially using the other knight to go to this f5 square. We get knight g3, takes, knight h6. We get rook to e2 here, swap, knight f5, g3, guarding the pawn on h4. We have the move knight e6, knight c2, c5, and now we have this move knight e3, knight g7, knight c2, and the game ends by repetition in a draw. Now, a very disappointing game from the general standpoint that there really wasn't anything super exciting going on. It ends in a draw, but nonetheless, I felt like I should show this game because there is obviously going to be some drama around the final round of the event, where we had Hans playing Jan instead of playing against Magnus. That being said, of course, Magnus is well within his right to not play it as a team event. You do not have to play every game. Many players do sit out various rounds, so there will probably be drama from that, but you know, who cares? At any rate, the game does end in a draw. So with this draw, I don't know the final standings, but I do believe that Magnus's team will not be the winners of the Rapid. The WR team, which won the World Rapid portion last year of this event, they are not going to repeat. In fact, I do intend to do a video about one of the Chinese players, Peng Bo, who had a remarkable performance throughout the event in the coming days. I'll do a video on that as well. But it looks like Magnus's team will not win in spite of him having a pretty good score overall. But at any rate, I thought you guys would enjoy a recap of Magnus's win over Ding, the current world champion, and of course the drama game between, Hans and Jan. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and I will be back with some more recaps from the World Rapid and Blitz Team Championship 2024 in the coming days. There will be a Blitz portion, so for sure we're going to recap some games tomorrow. So hope you guys enjoy it. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you soon. See you. Bye.